Hello, insiders. Thank you so much for being here this evening. As always, we are so delighted to have you here at the Times. Thank you for coming. We have a marvelous panel lined up for you tonight featuring some of the Times' sharpest journalists. They are going to wrestle with the issue that doesn't seem to go away, race. I was lucky enough to watch our national editor, Mark Lacey, in a live video chat earlier today. And out of that came a few salient points, which I'll share with you now. We are certainly not in an age where race doesn't matter anymore. It sounds almost quaint to me, but there was a time when people thought the election of Obama would herald a post-racial country. So much for that. In fact, during Obama's 2 terms in office, race became a subject of fierce debate. As you know, there were police shootings and clashes galore. And complicating how we think about race is the fact that racism is a really tough thing to measure. We know it's out there and we see the incidents, but it's also kind of amorphous. So how is media covering race? How are we covering race? And where do we go from here? Let's find out. Sharing their insights with us tonight, we have national editor Mark Lacey. We have Annie Corial, a Metro reporter, Sandra Stevenson, a visual editor, and Rachel Swarns, an editor covering race relations. Thank you so much and enjoy the talk.
Great. So I'm Mark Lacey. I'm going to kick us off, and thank you very much for coming. It's exciting for us. We work in this building every day, and we don't usually see Times readers amassed in such numbers here. And it's exciting. It's great. I mean, we have a sense that you're out there reading what we're doing, but to see you right here in front of us is wonderful. So you are right in the nerve center of the New York Times right now. Just so you know, Donald Trump, the president, when he visited us, was 1 floor up, just right up there, at a big conference table, and that's when he said he loved the New York Times, and then he changed his mind after that. So a lot of big meetings happen right here, and so welcome. So I am the national editor. I'm in charge of the bureaus all across the country and coverage of the country. I'm also the head of what we call Race Related, an interdepartmental team that covers race. And I'm going to introduce everybody here. And it's a great group. And basically, race is something that cannot be covered by one department, by one reporter, it influences everything, and so we have people across the New York Times who are interested in the topic, who are delving into the topic. So I think to start, we are going to see a little video. It's very brief. It's pretty cool, and so it's going to tell you a little bit about Race Related.
Ready?
So all of the images in there, all of that was produced by the team and was part of actual journalism. And so no longer do we view ourselves simply as a newspaper. We're this multimedia organization that produces videos and audio and photos, and we do a whole lot more than we used to. This is a star-studded group. I'm just a moderator. This is a star-studded group here. These are some of the best journalists at the Times, and I'm excited to hear what they have to say, so you should be excited too. And I'm going to run through, they're each going to talk about some of the stories they have worked on that I think you're going to find interesting. There's going to be a lot of time for questions, and so I hope that you've come with some. But clearly, race is a huge story. I think you all know that. I mean, there was that big alt-right convention in Washington right after the election. You remember that? Ben Carson the other day called African slaves immigrants. You had that tragic incident in Kansas recently where 2 Indian engineers are in a bar and are shot by a man who tells them to go back to their country and believes they're from the Middle East. There's so much going on right now. There's so much for us to grapple with. Rachel Swarns is a longtime reporter at the Times. I knew her first when met her in Africa. She was the South Africa bureau chief. I was the Nairobi bureau chief. And she's worked a lot in Washington, written a book in Washington. She is now a reporter with the task of covering race in America, just this very narrow beat of race in America. And she's done some spectacular work. I'm going to let her talk about some of that, but this is Rachel Swarns, and she's one of our best. Annie Coriel works on the Metro staff, part of race-related, has also done some very, very special work on ethnic communities particularly in New York City. She did a fabulous story that you're going to hear about that started when she was walking along the street and found something, and I will not give the punchline away. Sandra Stevenson on the end is a visual editor at the Times. I first started working with her on the foreign desk, and she was the picture editor on the foreign desk. And so on the foreign desk, you deal with all of these tragedies every day, and you sort of begin to view them as just stories. And Sandra in our meetings would come in with photos and make us see them as real tragedies when they were, and she'd sort of force us to watch to sort of see what we were writing about and what we were editing. And she's a very passionate journalist and an essential part of the team. But I'm going to start with Rachel Swarns and let you talk a little bit, and we'll go down the line, and you will have some time you'll have plenty of time to jump in a little bit later. But Rachel, why don't we start with you?
Sure. It's so great to be here, and thank you all for coming. As you can see here, we're going to start with a piece about Donald Trump, and how could we not? The title of our talk today is Race in America, Racial Progress or Racist Progress. And as you all know very well, the election of Donald Trump was an enormous surprise, political upset for us, in the media. And I very well recall the day after the election results had come in, us gathering around as a group, race-related, where do we go, where do we take this story? And I was also beginning to see on Facebook, on social media, just responses from people. And so we write about all kinds of things, subjects, Mark is joking, the very narrow subject of race, because race touches on so many things. But with this, we started thinking about how do we talk about this election this election result in terms of race. And one of the things that I was seeing, even in those just overnight, early morning hours, were, people who were frightened, people who were worried about talking about their children, people of color who were saying, what does this mean for us, and will I fit, will my children fit in Trump's America? And one of the things that really interested me was how Trump supporters thought about this. Were they, how conscious, how much was race a part of their decision? Were people aware of the concerns that were percolating in communities of color around the country? And so what I suggested and what I ended up deciding to do was to spend some time talking to white Trump supporters about race. And the question really was, what would you tell people of color about this election and what it means for them? And the format was a little different, and one of the great things about our group is that we experiment with all kinds of formats, not just the traditional story. I did the interviews, and the people just spoke for themselves. And it was a real range of people. We write a lot about the white working class supporters, but there were folks who there was a lawyer, there was an engineer, a forklift driver, several Obama supporters, first time around. And the interesting thing was that the conversations and their ideas were actually quite complicated. It won't be a surprise to you that most people, did not say, people of color should be worried under this administration. In fact, to a person, they said people should not be worried. President Trump is going to be president for everyone. However, as you kind of talked more and kind of dug down a little more, other things kind of bubbled up. So there was a great deal of concern, for instance, about immigration. So one woman said that she was concerned, for instance, about entitlement, about African Americans receiving too much in the way of entitlements, too much food stamps, too much welfare. That needs to change. He's going to do that. But also underlying that was some insecurity, economic insecurity that she felt. She had voted for Obama the first time around. Her daughter had spent years at the post office trying to get a full-time job and working a temporary job. A guy who worked in a very interracial, multiracial workplace who was concerned about his community in North Carolina changing in terms of demographics, in terms of the number of immigrants who were arriving. So it was a very interesting and complicated conversation. I know that some people have concerns, supporters, Hillary supporters, people who are concerned about Trump, who are concerned about the idea of us normalizing some of these, opinions and voices that people have concerns about. But I think as journalists, it's really important for us to hear every voice. We know that readers, and even ourselves, we may or may not agree, but it's really important to hear those voices. And that's what this story was about. When Mark assembled this group, one of the things that was really important to the reporters on the group, and he said it right up front, was that we were not going to be kind of the stormtroopers on every single racial incident around the country, okay? Because it's really important for the institution to own coverage of race. And what Mark said, what we would do is that of course we would write about the news, but we would also, more importantly and more often, be what he described as value added, bringing something new, surprising, in-depth stories that you wouldn't read anywhere else. And this, I think, is a good example of that. You may remember the campus protests around the country. Many of them involved concerns about slavery and institutions' ties to slavery, in particular dealing with buildings and the names of buildings. In January of last year, I got an email from a colleague who had heard from an alum at Georgetown who said that he was in the process of trying to find the descendants of slaves who were sold to save Georgetown in 1838. And this email had come to a reporter on the business staff who was like, what? What do I do with that? She's like, oh, well, I know someone who might be able to help you. I had written a book about Michelle Obama and traced her ancestors back to the 1800s and late 1700s. And it is an amazing story. People are more familiar with it now. But basically, the nation's most prominent Jesuit priests were also very prominent slave owners. And they owned hundreds of slaves. And in 1838, in an effort to save their most important educational missionary project, they sold 272 people. Georgetown University has been grappling with that history. At the time when this story ran, only a handful of descendants from those slaves had been discovered. Now hundreds have been discovered. They have formed groups. Georgetown has announced that it will, for the first time, offer preferential status in admissions to descendants. And the stories really ignited a conversation around the country about this history, grappling with it, and really the question of how it reverberates in our current times. That's Georgetown. We were actually able to harness social media and other reporting tools to find more people tied to that. And this is a story that ran about a couple of weeks later, where we asked people, do you think that you have a personal connection to this group of 272 people? And we had archival materials where their names were listed, and we were able to actually identify more of these families. I have a passion for history, and I would encourage all of you, a plug for another race-related project is we do a talk, a live chat on Facebook on Wednesday nights at 9 p.m. So tune in, everyone. But this was another story where we looked at a current day issue through the lens of history. I was at a holiday party and I heard that the Schomburg Center, which is part of the New York Public Library, had some letters, had found letters in a file from President Obama's father. They were letters seeking scholarships to the United States when he was in Kenya. They were his transcripts, references from college advisors. And I left this party and was like, does anyone know about that? I had never heard about that. It took me about 5 months of a lot of conversations and negotiations with the New York Public Library to actually get access to those letters. But it ended up being about a dozen of these letters, which were, some of them in the president's father's own hand. And the story was about President Obama's father, who came to this country, a very bright, extraordinarily bright man from impoverished circumstances. But it ran on Father's Day. It was also the story of a difficult relationship between father and son, because the Schomburg discovered these letters in 2013, informed the Obama administration, and no one came to see the letters. So it was a really powerful and fascinating story about father and son and that difficult relationship. And the last one that I'll talk briefly about was about last summer. It seems like a world away, but Mark was alluding to all of the violence of last summer, the police-involved shootings, the shootings of police officers. And my editor and I, at the time, was again, thinking about, the correspondents around the country were writing about the events as they were unfolding. What could we bring to this? And my editor had a crazy idea. He said, what kinds of families would be affected by this? He said, well, what is it like if there was a white police officer married to a black woman? And I was like, well, that would be interesting. How unlikely is that? But I decided to listen to my editor, which is always a good idea. And I made a few calls, and within a day, I found dozens of families. And then it became a matter of, you know, who was willing to let a reporter into their lives for a little bit. And this couple in Baltimore, white police officer and his wife, black woman from the South, with a little boy, let me spend time with them. And it was a real heartbreaking story sometimes about how the racial divide ran right through their living room and how they tried to manage that. She was a Black Lives Matter supporter. He had real questions about it as a white police officer. At the same time, he had this little boy who was just a few months old, and for the first time, he was thinking about what it would be like for this little child when he was a young man confronted by a white police officer. So it was a very intimate, personal kind of story, the kind of story that I love to do, and the kind of story that we really want to bring to you, because we want to try and help people understand each other, I think, across these divides.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I'm Annie. I'm on the Metro desk, like Mark said. Thank you for joining us tonight. I, like Rachel, I love history. I think that it's a way for us to deepen the conversation about race at a time when it can get so heated on both sides. So how do you do that without, losing people's interest and attention when there are 800 other links and stories to look at? I think one way, as you implied, was for us to bring ourselves into the story. There are a number of ways to do that. In my case, I had the strange good fortune to find a photo album on the street in Brooklyn. I found I didn't know whether it was a scrapbook or a photo album, but I was walking down the street, and illuminated as if by a spotlight one summer night was this photo album. And it was wrapped up in twine, so I knew that it didn't end up there by accident. Whoever put it there intended for it to be picked up with the recycling. And I sort of changed its course and took it home. And I opened it, and what I found was just this wonderful, very complete artifact of one family's life. It was a record of a couple who had gone from the Jim Crow South, like so many hundreds of thousands, millions of families, from the segregated South to the North, and had come to New York. At the time, I didn't know that. What I saw were just these beautiful photographs of a black family from mid-century, and a very candid, intimate, happy record of arrival. So what it didn't have were many names. And so I turned over, there were 167 photographs. I turned each one over, I thought, okay, if I approach this as a reporter, it's gonna be pretty straightforward. I mean, we have researchers here, we have resources. It was not as straightforward as I thought it would be. There were only first names, and one first name sort of appeared in a few different places, and that was Etta Mae. So with the first name, I couldn't get any further. With all the researchers in the world, you can't find someone with just a first name. So I went back to the neighborhood, and which was, most of you, I assume, live here. As you know, Crown Heights is one of many neighborhoods in the city that is gentrifying, changing very quickly. I had moved away from Crown Heights, and in that interim, many of the older families, black families, had passed away, had moved away, had sold their homes. So I was beginning to despair that I would ever find who it belonged to when I met an older couple, and they identified the people in the album as Etta Mae and Ike Taylor. And as I'm looking through it with them, they found themselves, Sandra, if you could go back, they found themselves in the album. And so for me, what had been this sort of object of historical fascination, suddenly I realized this was an event in someone's life. This was June 28th, 1952. It was their wedding reception. That's Sissy Burton, Lenore, and James Burton, and they became my first guides. And from there, I went and found the family in North Carolina, and using a mix of historical records, census records, newspaper clippings, and the family's memories, I reconstructed the story of Etta Mae and Ike Taylor. So it was a wonderful opportunity to step away from the news, step away from, I mean, this was last year, so it was the campaign, it was the election, and sort of go a little bit back into our shared past. The story was published about a month and a half ago, the same weekend as Trump announced the so-called refugee ban. And so people were actually very grateful to have a story that wasn't about the news and also took maybe a more human, personal look at America and Americans and how New York City has been created in many ways by migrants and immigrants of all kinds. So the response was terrific. It was completely overwhelming. I was very worried. I think that, the greater part of valor is, discretion and restraint. And so I tried to sort of take a step back. Even though I'm in the story and it's told in the first person, I really tried to let the people I met tell their own story. And readers responded very movingly, saying that it reminded them of their family's story, or that it showed them something about their city that they had never known. So that was a wonderful experience, and I think it's shown us that our readers really do have an appetite and patience to read a much longer story. This was a magazine-length story. Of course, the photos make it seem shorter, but it was actually quite long. So I think it was an experiment in seeing how we may do similar projects in the future.
I too want to thank everyone for coming out this evening. As the visual editor, my job is to support Rachel and Annie and other reporters and how can we tell their stories through visuals, which is always an interesting and exciting opportunity, A, to work with reporters, and B, to try to connect the story with a photographer who could really carry it forward and really connect and relate. In addition to that, I wanted to explore a different way to tell stories visually, and one way, of course, is through social media. And so I started this Instagram account, which has been really a delightful way to reach readers in a different way. Some images are from our highlight images from our Lens blog, which is a photo-driven blog, part of the New York Times. Some images are, photos that were part of larger stories that maybe didn't make the cut for the paper online. When we started to kick it off, we were working with 3 media makers. I know in the video you saw the POV. And one way we wanted to kick it off was something more interactive. So we used Instagram Story. So each of the media makers here, each day would ask each other an awkward race question. And then they would post an image that would sort of convey, or actually a GIF, that would sort of convey what they were feeling. And it was actually really interesting because then you could see other readers who were tuned in, and they would sort of chime in and connect with the images. They'd either identify with the question or not identify with the question or ask further questions. So in my mind, that was quite successful. The other thing that I really love to do is feature people that we don't really think about, or people who may not be huge media makers. For example, this is the gentleman who created Pinyin in the Chinese language. It was an image from his obit. Here, I sent a photographer who was covering a story with one of our reporters about the gang violence in Chicago. And one thing that always strikes me is a father-son relationship. And I thought this was, the most beautiful moment that, one can express in a photo. This was part of a series out of Milwaukee about segregation and self-segregation, which was really interesting because we had African-American families who, had a quite high salary income, but they chose to live in a lower income neighborhood, partially out of comfort, partially, mainly out of comfort and opportunity to expand and grow. Of course, we've been covering the Standing Rock protests, and this image was when the government decided to put a stay on any sort of construction on Standing Rock. And here we have another story where we have two communities down south who had, in the past had a lynching that, created a lot of friction in the community, and so the police department decided to come forward and apologize. And so, to me, this image sort of conveyed a meeting of the minds and sort of a reconciliation of people. And of course, we also had a series about, or a story about Harry Belafonte. He turned 90 recently, and again, a really poignant portrait. In this particular image, another thing that I like to do is also not only highlight our stories, but also get photographers involved. I'll ask them to take over the Instagram account for a period of time. And this woman from the Bronx, this photographer from the Bronx, found a community of Hispanic or Latina Muslim women. And she interviewed them, she wanted to hear what they had to say, especially after Trump. And it was interesting because they faced two different types of racism, practicing Islam, and also being Hispanic. Practicing Islam in a Latin community, for some families, caused a lot of friction, and then they have to, further experience hatred from, the wider community. As far as all the images and what I love to work with, I really do try very hard to push the envelope. Unfortunately, we can't show everything, but I really try very hard to push the envelope in terms of how can we reach people, how can we make them feel something, not just through words, but the power of photo and the power of video.
Great.
Yep.
Thank you all. Applause is fine, sir. No, that's some amazing work. It's some amazing work, and you should look up all of their names after this. So we really do want to hear from you questions, but we will also take suggestions on things that we should be covering. Complaints, we get a fair number of those, but we can take them. The other day I had 47 missed or voicemails on my office line, so I knew something was up. I had just gone to the men's room. It wasn't that, so it was that my name was put out on some social media site as the person you should call for something. And so all of the people said the exact same thing. But I had to listen to them because I didn't know if there was something, if my wife was like number 37 or something. So I listened to them all. But so we do hear some on the phone, but in a setting like this, I'm really interested in what you think we should be doing more of. But here's your chance to question us on how we do things and the news. So we have two people out with microphones. So if anybody does have a question, just raise your hand. we have someone over here, and we'll go back and forth and take some.
I think
Right
she's
here.
right there.
So today I read or heard somewhere that Jeff Sessions was actually doing two things. One was trying to change the rules now around private prisons, but also around how we deal with drugs, which both seem to me kind of racially induced. So the question is, do you guys see that as a political story? Do you see it as a racial story? When there's something like that with huge implications for the African American community, for the immigrant community, how do you decide
Yeah, I don't. It's a good
that
question.
kind of coverage?
It's a good question. So we don't have any sort of a meeting where we have to make that declaration. We have to cover, as national editor, we have to cover everything that's going on that we view as significant in the country every day, every week, and we have to explore it in all its complexity. And so you didn't mention Jeff Sessions also declaring that he didn't want, he wanted the Justice Department to back away from monitoring troubled police departments. And that he had a sense that this oversight was diminishing the effectiveness of departments and sort of interfering with officers. There is so the Washington Bureau is not represented up here, but I'm in constant contact with, has more reporters right now than it has ever had in history, and we keep finding that the number we have is not sufficient, and we're adding more. So we're actually hiring people. So we have more reporters assigned to cover the White House right now than we ever have in previous 40-odd presidents. So there's 5 full-time White House reporters. I covered the White House during the Clinton administration, and there were 2 people, and my colleague got sick, had surgery, and so they sort of said, you can handle things. It was post Monica Lewinsky that had sort of been dealt with. But we have a huge number of people. We have multiple people covering the Justice Department. Every single governmental department, we have people not just covering the pronouncements, but digging through the budget, talking to the civil servants, and really trying to find out what's being changed that is not being announced. And so there's a massive effort, ongoing effort, to sort of document the changes in policy, some of which are trumpeted and others which are not. That's a good line, I should say. So that's going on. So I don't. So there are so many. Virtually every news story, because I lead this team, I can find a racial dimension in virtually anything. It can be raining outside, and I can think of something. We have a team of people who are trying to dig deep and write really. We didn't talk about the amount of time they took on some of these projects, but my job as an editor is to sort of protect Rachel and Annie from getting drawn into all of the daily distractions, but still nudge her to when are we going to have that Georgetown piece? Because there is so much happening news-wise that we feel as though people need to know, but we're a big enough, a specialized enough staff that we can have reporters working for months, up to a year on a story, and then we can have others who are, chasing daily stories, and so it's really an unbelievable operation when you see it up close. But we have both things going on at the same time, and we realize as well, despite the clearly all of the people care deeply about what's happening in government right now, and it's one of our primary obligations is reporting on that. People also want a break from politics as well, and so Annie's story, was gobbled up by readers, and we know how many people read stories online to the last person, so we can tell, and so people really relish a little bit of a break from the news. I know I do. We have a no politics rule at the dinner table just because I can't, I need to escape. So in the back, we had a couple people. Yeah, there's some mics heading in your direction.
How do you break it up between investigative reporting and straight reporting? Because a lot of what you just said seems to be more investigative reporting than straight news.
Yeah. There used to be a distinction that was fairly clear, and investigative reporters essentially had a long time to dig deep, and everybody else really had, it's a daily newspaper. We would if you had 3-4 days, if you had 2 weeks, that was a long time. So it used to be that way. It's no longer that way. There is a daily meeting at 12 o'clock of all the major news departments at the Times. On the phone, on the squawk box is the Washington Bureau's investigative editor. There's the investigative team, there's the national desk, the BizDay is there, international is there, and they're talking about investigations connected to the Trump administration, and there's no longer long-term, months away. There's too much to look at. Time is too short. There is a churn of investigative stories that is more like a regular story. So, and there may be an investigative reporter at the Times looking at something that's not related to government, but I don't know who that person is. So I don't want to declare nobody is, but I don't happen to know that person if they do work.
Good evening. I have a 2-point kind of observation, which I think is very timely given everything that's happening. I would like to pose this observation from where I'm coming from, that do you guys not feel that as the New York Times that perhaps you cover race from a very black perspective as opposed to covering it? I feel at times you could cover it from the Caucasian, the way the Caucasians see it. And I think as such, sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes it seems like you're making a case. You're making a case that African Americans deserve more recognition, so forth and so on. But sometimes I think it's a question of what, and this is what Donald Trump has done with his supporters, that there's a feeling that there's a melting pot, and we were here in the melting pot, and we're getting smaller and smaller, and we're shrinking. And as a white culture, I think there's a serious question that needs to be addressed at the editorial level, that how do you cover white culture and all the beautiful things about white culture, which are not hurtful or hateful, and make the young up and coming white kids fall in love with their white culture and not feel like it has been displaced. For example, Lord of the Rings is a mythology that people say is it reminds people of their white culture. I mean, stuff like that, which could make people stop feeling that it's only race when it's coming from a black perspective.
That is a perfect question for Rachel Swart.
I would say, I think it's a very interesting question. A couple of things. One is that you've seen a snapshot of what we do, and the video I think gives a broader sense. So we write about African Americans, we write about people of color across the board in terms of the group, though African Americans are an important part of the coverage. The other thing is, though, in terms of white Americans, I also would say a couple of things. One is that we really have. I mean, there was kind of some debate, about when the election came, the results came, about how well we actually did in terms of covering white voters and where their sentiments were. This was, a debate that was happening internally as well as, around the country. It was one of the reasons why I was interested in doing the piece that I did about white voters and how they viewed race. I think if you looked carefully, though, at our coverage, that we did, in very deep ways at different times, look at white voters and how they were responding to Trump. We all got it wrong. Everybody got it wrong. That's true, too. But I also think, though, that if you look at the New York Times, I think it is fair to say that we, for the most part, this is a team that is writing about race, but in part it was put together because most of what we cover is not this. Most of what we cover is, the predominantly white world around us. And in fact, one of the issues we have in terms as we want to grow our audience is that, a lot of people of color don't see themselves in the New York Times. And in fact, most of the concerns that we hear on this front is that we don't reflect America. We reflect a segment of it. At the same time, I think we are thinking very consciously, knowing that, people, one of the things that was interesting when I was talking to white Trump voters was the number of people who said they didn't say who they wanted to vote for. They were uncomfortable. They thought they might be labeled. And so they kept it to themselves. And I think we have a team of, and Mark, I'll hand it right back to you, Mark. We have a team of people who are writing around the country. Sabrina Tavernisi is one reporter I know who is interested and has been writing even before this about whites in communities that are struggling. And I think we are very interested in that. But I think if you look at the paper as a whole, I think it would be hard to argue that we don't cover white America well. Where I think we do wrestle, though, is in terms of different demographics, and I think we are always among whites, among people in general. We want to make sure that we have a very affluent audience. We are in New York City. We write about powerful institutions. That ends up, whether that's in culture or in government. And so sometimes that might we have to be mindful that we are not skewing in one direction, and I think we are being very mindful.
Yeah, it's a good answer. I'll address the portion of the question, are we doing enough to cover Trump supporters out in the country? I don't think we did enough before. I don't think all of you should have been as surprised as you were on election night if I do view it as our job to prepare you for the world, and so I don't think you should have been as surprised as you were, and I believe everyone. If someone was not surprised, you raise your. So we have I think that it's part of our job. So I don't think we succeeded there, and I think we are. I am redeploying national correspondents around the country. I don't believe we had enough people. I think we had concentrations of people in big cities, east, west coast, major cities across America. I don't think we had enough of a sense of rural America, small town America. And I'm not just talking. I'm not just talking. People who voted for Trump. I think there's all sorts of issues that come up. I want another. We have a single religion correspondent at the New York Times. I'm hiring a second one, and I'm calling it a faith and values correspondent. I want this person out in the country talking to people about what they believe in, whether they are involved in organized religion or not, what their beliefs are. And so I do think that we can do better, and I think you're going to notice you're going to notice this coverage in the months ahead. I mean, we have a team of some of the best journalists at the New York Times who are not investigating the government, not doing daily stories, who are assigned to help explain these divisions in our country in many different ways. And that's what you alluded to, and those stories are underway, and you're going to see them. And the goal of those is for all of us to, despite everybody's politics, to learn. We're such a divided country, and there's all sorts of statistics that show that people hang around people with the same politics and don't understand other people. And this is going to be journalism designed for everybody across the country, everybody across the world, but to try to understand people who have a different view of the world than you do. So that's the goal, and you're going to see great stories. Come on, over here. Yeah, excuse me.
I was wondering if you've ever done a story on post-racial sub-communities, so maybe a community where you have people from lots of different ethnic and socioeconomic backgrounds coming together and functioning in a very healthy way.
Is everything a downer, Rachel?
I'm trying to think of what we've done.
We have a great story planned that could go that way, or it could become a downer story. And I'm going to give you a shorthand of it because I don't want to ruin this, because I'm really excited about this story. So we're going to look at one of the most diverse areas of the country statistically, and really hone in on a small area that is just an absolute melting pot of racial harmony, statistically speaking. And then we're going to see what that actually looks like at play dates and dinner parties, and how does it translate to the way people actually interact and we're going to be exploring that in a very deep way. And I think that will be fascinating. And I think what we'll find, I mean, we're still identifying the location, and the reporter will be very angry that I'm telling this to the public, but it's going to be a great story. So look for this. You will know when it comes. So I think one thing we're going to find is the importance of schools and sort of the how integrated schools do a great deal to integrate communities and to get parents together who otherwise would not get together. That's what I believe we'll find. And so this could be the heartwarming tale you're asking about, but I don't know yet. Yes, over here.
I just want to thank you all for all the work that you've been doing and giving us access behind the scenes as well. I'm one of the people who's been gobbling it up. I wrote a dissertation on performance of race and ethnicity in the 19th century at the turn of the millennium, so some time ago, and gosh, I wish this effort had been around then. It would have been very useful. Something, Annie, you said about putting yourself in the story just made me remember about, writing on topics of race and identity and power are often very personal and vulnerable making. I'm curious if you've come upon a story or a story's come to you, and if for a personal, emotional, ethical reason, you just felt at one time like, I'm not equipped to do this.
Well, I felt like that with the photo album story. The photo album story. I've been reporting in New York for a decade, and I've gone to all sorts of neighborhoods and reported on really sad stories. But because this was a black family, my race was much more of a palpable thing that I had to reckon with. I'm half Colombian, so I speak Spanish. I'm Latina. Oftentimes I'm talking to people where the language is the currency. I mean, it's the way that we bridge a divide. And of course I'm speaking English, but there were all these walls that we don't usually acknowledge. These were my neighbors, but we had lived very separate lives, as most New Yorkers do. I mean, we often don't know our neighbors. So with this story, I felt, that reporting it was reporting it. It was when it came to writing it where I said I had to really figure out, how do I address these issues without, going too much into identity politics or gentrification? How do I do it? And I decided to just come out and say it, and say I had never seen a black family's photo album. And it was just that admission that allowed me to then just go on to the story. But I think without that admission, we're not acknowledging our history and some of the legacies of that history. So I did feel quite apprehensive, but I think it became less and less of an issue once you just sort of take that step. But I think it's something that you have to do very mindfully, very honestly, acknowledge the things that you know and you don't know. So that's the case with reporting always, but it was particularly the case with this story.
Rachel, did you have one on that? It's a good question.
It is a good question. When we were first getting the team together, we had a brainstorming meeting, which I tried not to hate enormously. I sometimes hate brainstorming meetings. In the meeting, though, we were kind of casting, throwing out story ideas, and, I said, I know nobody, this is not really a story, but I've been really grieving Cliff Huxtable. And one of our digital people said, "Oh my God, that is such a story." I was like, "Oh no, that's not a story." It really is not. I had worked as a columnist before joining the team, and so it wasn't, though it was a news column where I mostly wrote about New York City and people's lives, not mine, though I had gotten a little comfortable with the first person. But this was, I really did not want to write this piece. And an editor in Culture kept harassing me about the piece. And finally, I decided I would at least sit down and think about it. And the reason why I really hesitated was because it really was so personal. It was really in a kind of thematic way, above how I felt about it, but part of what I felt about it was, can you separate the artist from the art? And I never met Bill Cosby, but I knew and loved Cliff Huxtable. And as a teenager growing up in New York City, when, in a middle-class black family where we never saw ourselves on screen, it was, I actually ended up writing about, we sat every week, we had popcorn, we laughed and laughed, and it was just like, they were far wealthier than we were, but so many things, there were so many connections, and it made me feel visible in a way that is very hard to talk about, because you're dealing with then feelings of invisibility. And as a young person, it made me think about, maybe, when I go to the store, the people who are following me around might think, oh, maybe she's an honor student, which I was, and not someone trying to steal something. And so, I wrote about that. I wrote about, once it went into reruns, I never watched it, but I knew that he was there. And about how when, the depositions came out where he actually admitted to drugging women, that I cried. It was a very difficult piece to write, but I'm glad that I did it. And we are encouraged to do this kind of crazy stuff now.
Although, for the record, as the editor leading the coverage of the less inspirational part of that story, the deposition and the court and from accusers, and I did not want to go anywhere near this story. But what's really great is that there's a lot of difference of opinion at the Times on what we should cover. There's spirited debates, and different editors. One editor will love a story, one will not want to go near it, and it's really it's a healthy thing. It's a healthy. I want to just give my quick answer to that question. So what's really interesting about one's own race definitely influences your journalism and how you're covering and your ease in covering journalism. And I was, so my father was black, my mother was white, and that it's been a tremendous advantage to sort of be a little bit nebulous as to what I am, as I've been a foreign correspondent, because wherever I go, people think I'm from the next country over. and so it's happened everywhere. So I was based in Nairobi. I would go to Somalia, and I got a great deal of respect because they thought I was like Eritrean or Moroccan. And I then moved to Mexico, and I was South American, I was Caribbean. When I went to Cuba a lot, I was the Cuba correspondent for a while, and whenever I went to Cuba, the Cuban authorities, I would be in the American line, and they would tell me I had to go to the Cuban line. And they'd learn through my Spanish that I was not Cuban. But I could roam the streets of Havana and go to Cuban-only restaurants get on Cuban-only buses, and as long as I was mum, it was fine. But then I'm old enough that I was at the LA Times during the LA riots. And so when the riots broke out, I drove to Florence and Normandy where things were hot, and nobody else or very few other people at the LA Times wanted to go there or felt safe going there. I just found it fascinating. So I'm standing right there, and it was very violent. There were rocks being thrown at passersby, and it was very sort of racial. It was if you were not black, you were not really safe at this intersection. And it was just clear that cars are going by, people are watching, and I'm standing there, and at one point, a guy next to me says, "You black?" And I assured him, I stressed my father's side of the equation and stressed that I was very extremely black. Especially when one's overseas, but I think definitely covering racial issues, one's own identity comes up all the time and affects how you're covering stories. Go to the next.
Rachel, I think you mentioned that you were also looking at not only how you cover things, but the growth of the newspaper. My question is, how you look at race as an issue to be covered for the current readership and an expansion of that readership as it's constituted today, versus saying that African Americans may not see themselves in the Times. How do you balance the readership, the growth, and the coverage with the stories that you go after?
I'm going to hand this to Mark, but just to say that, my editor, while I was working on some of these stories, did a lot of work on audience. And what we know is that there are, you can look at it in a negative way in that our numbers are not nearly what they should be in terms of readers of color. But there are also great opportunities there. And there's a real, I think, hunger for this kind of reporting. And so, for instance, one thing we didn't talk about here, which was a visual project, was a project we did last year called Unpublished Black History. And basically what it was we went into the archives and found photos that had never been published before, and we told the stories behind them. And what was fascinating about that project was that we realized, those of us involved, and just reporters and editors involved with that project, realized very early on that there was a real, it was easy. People were saying, how can we get these pictures? There was a real hunger for this. And so we actually started thinking as reporters, which is unusual. It's not something in the old days we would think about, was that we needed to kind of sell these pictures. We needed to there's going to be a book with these pictures. So we are, it was, the creation of this group was, and Mark can talk more about that too, was about what was happening in the country. But I think we are cognizant that there are real opportunities, and actually it's enormously important in terms of how the country is changing.
Yeah, that's a good. I don't think that we're doing any stories, any projects that are designed for one subset of the population, so I don't think we're doing stories that are designed to bring in Latinos or designed to bring in Black readers or Asian American readers or that. We do have a Spanish language edition of the website, and that is clearly aimed at the Spanish speakers of the world. There's no doubt about that. But we are not. I don't think the stories we're picking are for one group. But I do think that having a more diverse group of journalists looking for stories that perhaps wouldn't have been covered in decades past, and looking at parts of the country, populations that aren't covered well, is just good for our current readers, and I think it also could help us expand our readership. And we are, the Times is very interested in, not interested in this building. These lights are dependent on readers. Everybody here, and our future is dependent on more readers. And so we want many more people reading the New York Times across the United States and all across the world, and it's a major objective of what we do. I think what we're doing could have that effect, and that would be wonderful. But these stories, everybody in this are designed for every single person in this room and every single existing Times reader. That's who they're designed for. Over in the back.
Hi. So I guess my question is kind of pushing back, I think, on some of the other points that have been brought up in the talk so far. This kind of idea of a fabled, frankly, post-racial America. This idea that we should be surprised that Trump won. I think I was not surprised that Trump won. I think if you talk to a lot of people of color in the US, they were not surprised that Trump won. And I'm like troubled by this coddling, I think, that happens of Trump voters. I mean, if we look at the median income of a Trump voter, it's $72,000. I have never made $72,000. My family, no one in my family has ever made $72,000. So to say that this is just a story of an angry, disenfranchised, working class white America is just, it's false, one. And two, also ignores the fact that people of color are the working class in the US. And that their interests, these interests that Trump voters are claiming, are the interests of people of color. And they were not voting for Trump. And frankly, like, the New York Times is the only news I read these days, because I can't really look at the TV or look at other things. So this is not, I'm not trying to attack my only source of news today. But what I want to do is challenge the New York Times and the rest of this media to kind of take this issue more seriously, that this is not just a story of class, this is a story of race in America, and the fact that we're living in one of the most divided Americas that we've ever lived in. I mean, the growing inequalities, the gap between white America and black America, and all the people of color that fall in between there, except for Native Americans, we're like at the bottom of the pile. And I think we have this narrative where we're forgetting that, and it's a fear of addressing like the truly urgent and horrible fact of like race in America and the historical origins of this country. And I want to challenge the Times, and I want to challenge you who are covering race for the Times to take that more seriously.
Yeah, I think you've made you received more applause than we did. No, I mean, the very, very heartfelt, persuasive comments there. I mean, I don't want you to think that our coverage is coddling. That would make all of us feel all of the people who are poring over all sorts of policies and out in the country covering what's going on right now would bristle at that characterization. I had a meeting earlier today where I was talking about how we should better cover white supremacy in America right now. So I get what you're saying, and I get completely what you're saying. And the election of Donald Trump has brought out a real ugliness in America that has made it very visible. It's not surprising to a lot of people, but it's much more visible than it ever has been, and that it's a reality. So I hear what you're saying. I have just received the last question, the last question card. So and I'm going to point to this gentleman here because he's been trying to get.
I have a short question, though, regarding the last year election. And this country is divided in. It divided in sections, talking about educated people, people without education. So this group right here, it's pretty much a selective group because most people watch TV, okay? And there's a lot of things you can do as far as if you look at young people right now, especially black folks. I go home 6 o'clock in the news, you see all this going on in black neighborhood. I don't think you report anything, white neighborhood, black neighborhood, people killing people and all that. And I think news is everywhere, okay? As far as what you're doing, this is pretty good, it's good. But you have a lot of children, I guess you can start with them from school because you need at least 3 generations to change the system. Because those right now that's doing a lot of bad stuff, I mean, they're gonna be bad for a while. But let's go to the school, start from there. You do have what they call charter school right now because they don't want to educate the public school. So at this point, I would say, let's start with the school, and if there's no money, get the money from the government.
I'm going to, you mentioned a couple things that I wanted to jump at. The coverage of violence in our cities. I mean, our president is very focused on Chicago, and he mentions it every other day. I mean, last year, the New York Times, maybe it's our fault. Last year, we did a series of stories. We sent about 10 reporters, videographers, photographers, graphic artists, a huge team to Chicago over Memorial Day weekend, and we went to every single shooting that happened in Chicago over the 3 days. And we were often, I went myself and tried reporting again. I've been in a cubicle for a few years, so I went and it was round the clock. It was, the New York Times was often the only news organization there. And so we were trying to make people had become inured to these numbers of 62 people in a weekend, more people dying than in Baghdad, and we were trying to make people feel it, and I want you to see that story. So what we followed up that story with, and it was mentioned up here, is John Eligo, a reporter who covers race, spent several months with a Chicago gang hanging out and getting a sense of what it is like to be a young person growing up in the south side of Chicago today, and he came away with a very complex portrait of what it's like. And John Eligo does not view, I talked to him as he was doing his reporting and as I was telling him to be careful, and he said he viewed these people who they were in their 20s, early 20s, late 20s, most of them he was hanging out with, as these are good guys, we have great conversations, and they're just growing up in this awful reality. And I urge you to read both those pieces. We're trying to get at some of what you were talking about there. But the Times has a educational component, and we distribute the newspaper to schools all across the country. We make the digital subscription. We distribute to schools and universities. I go and talk to schools all over New York I love it. They always ask me who's the most famous person that you've ever interviewed, and then they've never heard of any of the famous people that I know. But like, I agree with every word that if we're going to change the country, and if we want more readers, we have to be focused on young people. Absolutely. So
We
I
have a
agree.
new program too, right?
Yeah, we have
About-
yeah.
Yeah, where people can
There's
donate
one more thing
subscriptions.
I like to say about the media.
Yeah.
As far as, I believe TV, newspapers, that costs money for advertising. I don't think Mr. Trump is spending a penny in advertising, because the media follow Mr. Trump everywhere. One time I thought I was watching Fantasy Island. There was a plane coming down, they were looking for Mr. Trump coming down.
Yep.
I think the media put him where he is now, I think, in some way.
That has been, you are not the first person to say that, and I'm not going to, it's a fair criticism. I am being told we have to wrap up. I'm not running anywhere, so if you have any last minute question, you can ask us, but thank you to all these panelists.